Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, BCLT, for hosting this event. We will start with some brief introductions. My name is Mayada Ibrahim, and I'm a translator working between Arabic and English. I'm also an editor, and I work as the managing editor at Tilted Access Press. And I live in New York, in Queens, as of the last 2 years, but I lived for most of my life in the UK. I'll pass it over quickly to Kira.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's really great to get this chance to talk about translation and labor organizing. My name is Kira Josefsson. I'm a translator from Swedish into English. I'm also a writer, writing on US politics and culture in the Swedish press. Like Mayada and Alex, I live in New York. It's very early here, but we're still very glad to be here.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, in case there are even some people joining from that time zone or those time zones. My name is Alex Zucker. My pronouns are he, him. As Mayada and Kira said, yes, I'm also in New York City. I translate Czech, mostly literary work, but I worked for almost 10 years translating other things before I translated my first novel. I'm just you can find out more at alexjzucker.com. That's my website. And I just want to really thank the Writers Center Norwich and the British Center for Literary Translation Summer School for having us.
So we'll start with some opening remarks and then go into our talk. So Alex, Kira, and I are members of the newly founded and still developing Translators Organizing Committee, which is a division of the National Writers Union. And that's a labor union in the US that represents freelance workers working across all genres, formats, and mediums. And it has 1,300 members in 3 local chapters. The idea behind this organizing effort was to organize for better contractual terms and working conditions for literary translators. And we'll talk much more about that. But this panel is not specifically about the work that we're doing at the Translators Organizing Committee or TOC. It's more about kind of showing like the historical efforts that of translation advocacy over the years, and bringing us to the current moment to maybe shed light on what directions might be taken in the future. And the current members of the TOC, in addition to us, are Adrian Minkley, Alison Markin-Powell, Dave Smith, Larissa Kaiser, Sean Bai, and Soleil David. And I want to mention here that this organizing effort was born out of an earlier effort dating back to December 2021 that included Lisa Hoffman-Kuroda, Barbara Ofusu-Somoa, and Edward Gorman. And to give you a little bit about what the National Writers Union is, it's been around for a while, and it has a long history of winning better conditions for freelancers. So, for example, in recent years, it reached an agreement with Out magazine to pay back 24 freelancers for about $40,000 worth of work that happened over 8 months. If you find yourself on their website and look in their About page, you'll see that there's they have a page where they kind of list all the recent wins that they've had. But they've been around since the 80s, I believe, maybe a bit longer than that. One of their divisions is called the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is part of the Digital Media Division. And that has achieved a lot of successes with something called the unilateral agreements. So those are agreements that the Freelance Solidarity Project works on with publications to basically outline baseline terms for freelance media labors. And that could be across writing or photography, illustration. And they make sure that those publications make those terms public. Some of the publications that they worked with include The Intercept, The Nation, Jewish Currents, Hellgate, and others. again, on the website, you'll be able to see exactly what terms, what those terms might look like. And we'll share some links at the conclusion of this panel too, so you can see. So yes, this effort is very new, but we've been embraced so wholeheartedly and given a lot of support by the NWU. And it's been a really great learning experience for me personally, because I came in kind of with the idea that because we're freelancers, we couldn't organize, that there was very little to do, but there is so much, and they've been doing that work, so it's been really enlightening. I'll pass it on to Kira.
Thank you so much, Mayada. Right, so we'll be doing this slightly more presentation style than us talking amongst each other, but we'll be moving or passing the mic a lot between each other. So as Mayada mentioned, this work is motivated by a desire to achieve better working conditions for translators. There's been sort of an upsurge in translation advocacy of various sorts, especially in recent years. But our working conditions have not improved. Our pay has not improved, as I'm sure all of you are all too well aware. We could look at the 2022 Authors Guild survey of US literary translators' working conditions, which found that the average rate for literary translations was 13 US dollar cents per word among those who answered the survey. That is 8% more than the average rate in 2017 in that same survey, which back then was 12 cents, US cents per word. But during that same time, the cost of living in the United States has gone up by more than 20%, which means that translator pay has in fact shrunk if you factor in inflation. And I'm sure that all of us feel that in our pocketbooks. We believe that the reason that pay and other working conditions have not changed significantly is because what's been missing from all previous initiatives around translator advocacy is an effort for translators to actually organize for better conditions as workers. We are workers. I think we often identify as artists and so on, which we also are, but we are also workers. We get paid for our work. We should get paid for our work. Our work is something that other people do make money off of. This theory that what's missing is organizing as workers is inspired by the legendary US labor organizer Jane McAlevey, who sadly passed away from cancer a few weeks ago. She was truly fantastic, and I recommend looking her up. Maybe we'll send an interview or two with her as well. Her work builds on, she hasn't come up with anything brand new or something that nobody's ever thought of before, but her work builds on the work of successful campaigns from a time when labor was stronger in the US than it is today. It's very focused on winning, which is refreshing. It distinguishes between advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. We'll give a deeper explanation of these three concepts soon, but I'll say for now that advocacy and mobilizing have both been far more common than organizing in the US, and I would imagine that the same is true in the UK in recent decades. And McAlevey believes that this is part of the reason that the left keeps losing. It's because we're simply not building power. We're bringing people out to the streets, but we're not building off of that. We're not building power. Back when unions were stronger, most workers tended to be tied to a specific workplace. They were not freelancers. And today, of course, freelancing is very common, not just among people who work in the culture industry, but also people who are gig workers. that sort of evolution in the working landscape, in the labor landscape, is part of the reason as well that labor isn't very strong. We do believe that Jane McAlevy's methods can be applied with a bit of imagination to freelance organizing as well. And so does the Freelance Solidarity Project in the National Writers Union. Finding a model for this could potentially be very consequential because there are so many freelance and gig workers who are very badly paid across the world today. We are, as I mentioned, going to do sort of a quick overview of the difference between these different core concepts of advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. Then we'll talk a little bit about histories of translation advocacy, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing or trying to do in the National Writers Union. And I'll pass it over to Mayada.
So I'm sharing my screen here to explain a little bit more about those three different approaches that Kira mentioned, based on the work of Jane McAlevey. So what's meant here, so we have advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing, as you can see. And what's meant by theory of power is how each of those approaches thinks about who needs to have power in order for change to happen. So we can see here that advocacy is not dependent on large numbers of people. It's not trying to kind of bring in masses. It's not inclusive. It's limited to people who already have power. So think of lawyers, pollsters, researchers, the media. It tends to seek out one-time wins and policy changes. Again, we can share with people later if they want to look at it a bit more closely. But just to summarize, mobilizing, on the other hand, you can think of it as sort of herding people, moving people into specific action. But those people crucially tend to already agree with your cause, with what you're trying to do. So you're not convincing people anew, or you're not. Again, it's not a mass or inclusive approach. Examples might be calling up a protest about climate. And finally, organizing is about relationships and building meaningful solidarities among majorities of people. This means it tries to expand the base by including the largest number of people possible, not only people who are likely to agree. And in order to be able to get to a majority with this kind of approach to organizing, you need a really well-defined structure within which that majority will build. That could be a workplace, which again, for us freelancers, requires a bit more thinking to figure out what that is. It could be something like a building for a tenants union, or your reps in a city. So that's kind of a brief breakdown of what we mean by each of those, and we'll talk more about that. I'll hand it over to Alex.
Thank you both, Mayada and Kira. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about advocacy, because most of the efforts to improve the lot of literary translators up to now have been in the realm of advocacy. And as far as I can tell, I know there are some researchers out there who I've started to get in touch with. This is not a research-based project, so we still have a lot to learn, and we're looking forward to that. But as far as we can tell, these advocacy efforts really date back to the mid-20th century. I said I don't do research. By that, I mean I don't do academic research, but I moderated a panel at the Alta conference in 2016 about translator advocacy, which I wrote up on a blog that I had at that time, and I can share those links when we send them out afterwards. So this is based on what I found doing that. And a landmark event in this regard was the first international meeting of translators of literary works, which was held in 1958 in Poland. So to give you a sense of how impactful this meeting or conference was, Among those who translate into English, this led in 1958, in other words, that same year, to the formation of the Translators Association in the UK, as well as in 1959, the next year, both the American Translators Association in the US and the Translation Committee of what was then called the PEN American Center. So ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, was not founded until 1978. The presiding officers at this first international meeting of literary translators in Poland in 1958 were from the International Federation of Translators and Polish PEN. The official languages of the meeting were French and English, with a preponderance of the former, according to an article I read. And the official agenda, there were 4 business meetings on the official agenda during the conference. And the focus of those 4 meetings was, number 1, the role of the translator of literary works and contemporary culture and in bringing nations closer together. Number 2, the art and theory of translating. Number 3, the professional interests of the translator. Number 4, means aiming at the deepening of the international exchange of literary works. So you can see right away how these things are still, these areas of focus are still, predominant in advocacy that happens. And there was a resolution adopted at the meeting, which I'm going to quote here in full, an action item, if you will. Literary translators and their organizations in all countries shall immediately launch a widespread campaign by way of articles in the press, discussions, and so on, to inculcate an appreciation among the general public of the importance and cultural value of the translator's work. Literary translators and their organizations shall insist that publishers give clear and proper indication of the translator's name in every book published, in all catalogs, advertisements, and so on. Literary translators and their organizations shall further, by all available means, strive to induce literary critics to include in their review and assessment of the work of the translator as co-author of the book, presented by him to the public in his native language. In the event of a critic omitting reference to the translator himself or his organization shall without delay demand that the editor of the journal concerned accord him his right by publishing a notice, article, or letter. So again, apart from the old pronouns, you can see, plus ça change, it's really, again, the same issues that we're talking about today.
Alex, can you remind us what year that was once again?
1958. So 68, 70, 78, 88, 98. So 66 years ago. Yeah. Again, important to note that the focus of this meeting, these points, was more on visibility for translators rather than pay. And jumping ahead in time, and I just want to acknowledge that this is unavoidably only a really thin sliver of the advocacy work that translators have done, and is also mainly focused on the efforts of people who translate into English, and especially now in this part in the United States. In 1970, so 12 years later, the Translation Committee of the PEN American Center published a manifesto. There was recently a new version of that written up and adopted by the committee. Published a manifesto and began work on what was called a minimum basic contract. So that's the forerunner of the model contracts we have today. I can sum up the focus of that advocacy by quoting an essay that was written by B.J. Beatrice Shute, then the president of the PEN American Center, who wrote in 1970, in connection with a conference in New York City titled The World of Translation, "For translation to flourish in this or any other country as it should, in parentheses, as it must, an ideal climate would supply certain basic necessities. recognition of the fact that the translator is indispensable. I just want to say here, the translator, not translation. That's us, the workers. Appreciation of the difficulty of his role, that is an art as well as a craft. Proper financial return for his labors and credit given where credit is due. So now we've got pay on the table along with visibility. I do want to single out here an important action by literary translators not in the US that stands out as an exceptional instance of organizing rather than advocacy or mobilizing, which was the 2006 new Norwegian Translators Work to Rule action. And I want to thank Susan Pickford for drawing this to our attention. I also want to point out that one really important difference between Norway and the US or the UK is that the Norwegian Literary Translators Association has a standard contract that applies industry-wide to all translations of literary fiction. So it's different working conditions, right? And so what happened was in 2006, it was not technically a strike because it wasn't a work stoppage. But what translators there did was they followed, their contracts, which they argued were outdated in terms of the pay and other conditions. So what they did was they followed the outdated requirements of their contracts, which said they had to deliver printed manuscripts to the publisher. So what they did, they sent their publishers printed manuscripts instead of electronic files so that the publishers were forced to scan in the pages. And this is why it's called a work to rule action. Your work just according to the rules. It's kind of the, oh shoot, what is that? There's a fairy tale that suddenly I'm blanking on. It's not Chicken Little. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. If somebody wants to throw it in the chat when they think of it. I didn't have this in my notes. I just suddenly thought of it. I love when fairy tales. Yes, thank you. Oh no, is that it? Okay, somebody will figure it out. Anyway, after so the publishers gave in after 5 months, and there is an article about this on the Seattle website, so we'll share that. The publishers gave in, invited the translators back to the negotiating table. After a month of negotiations, a new contract was signed. The result was better pay, a modernized contract, and according to this article, a renewed respect for the profession on both sides. Jumping ahead again, now we're back to the realm of advocacy. In 2013, Chinese to English translator Helen Wang in the UK originated the hashtag Name the Translator. More recently, Jennifer Croft, both a translator working from Spanish and Polish to English and an author of works in her own right, teamed up with author Mark Haddon on International Translation Day in 2021 to issue an open letter calling on publishers to hashtag name translators on the cover. And as of today, that open letter has been signed by over 2,700 people. Of course, there has been all kinds of other translator advocacy. I'm just going to rattle off a few here. We have Women in Translation Month, and in general, the Women in Translation advocacy that goes on throughout the year. The Black Translators Network, the BIPOC Literary Translators Caucus, the Queer Translation Collective, the Disability Visibility Project, which is not focused on translators, but includes them. There's also World Kid Lit Month, which uplifts translated literature for children, and global literature in libraries. In the UK now there is Fossil-Free Books, which is again not just for translators. And most recently there is the SALT project, South American Literature and Translation, as well as a whole host of translator collectives and language-specific translator associations. So some of these collectives, some of them actually are more associations, not collectives. Some of them practice a sort of mutual aid, and they all have different kind of operating models. And I will end the history there and pass it back to Mayada.
Thank you, Alex. Is it the South American or South Asian project? literary
Did I
translation.
say South American? South Asian. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. So yeah, there's been all these efforts, and they've definitely given translators a lot of visibility and probably contributed to diversifying the field. We know from the Authors Guild recent survey, I'm blanking on the year now. What year was that, Alex? Was it last year?
The last survey was conducted in 2022. Results came out in 2023.
Right. So we know from that survey that the percentage of translators who identify as Black / African American is twice as high as it was in 2022 than it was in 2017. And the percentage of translators who identify as Asian American or Asian is 5 times higher than it was 5 years ago. However, the percentage of respondents identifying as white remains virtually unchanged, and that is an indication that the profession remains overwhelmingly white.
But all of this is clearly an indicator that there are so many various amazing and inspiring projects and initiatives. Charlie Coombe also added Translators Aloud as one more in the chat. We could probably spend our whole hour just talking about all of them. But the point that we wanted to make here, in addition to highlighting all this work that's been done in the past and that is being done in the present, is what types of projects these are. Again, there is this incredible, beautiful diversity, but what they all share in common is that their efforts to advocate by and or for literary translators, or to mobilize literary translators on behalf of a campaign or a cause, but none of them actually organize us. Again, all very useful in many different ways, but they're not organizing efforts, and organizing efforts are what has been missing from translator sort of mobilizing work. What we mean by that is that they tend to be recruiting people who are already on board with the cause, but in a somewhat disorganized way. And what I mean when I say disorganized, it's not that the people who are running these projects are disorganized, but rather that it doesn't build. There's not a structure, like Mayada mentioned in her overview of Jane McAlevy's 3 concepts. If you're just pulling on people who sort of already agree with you, you don't know if you've gotten everyone that you need to get. You can have an open letter and you get 150 signatures, which is great, but you don't know if you have gotten all translators to sign on, for instance. For that reason, an open letter, for instance, most often will actually not do that much unless the addressee is already highly sympathetic to the cause. It will probably increase visibility. It might help people sort of spot each other as comrades in a cause or as people who agree with something. It will probably get people talking, but it is not likely to, in and of itself, push the addressee to actually do what you want them to do. I've signed and written many open letters. I do think that they're excellent. But again, in and of itself, an open letter is unlikely to actually push the recipient to do what you want them to do. As a different example, we can think instead, what would happen if all or a supermajority of the translators and writers who had ever worked with or had even had contracts underway with the publisher came together and built a structured campaign demanding that this publisher signed on with PACBI, which is the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. That work would be much harder because it would entail sort of cordoning off that structure that you want to work within, you would have to get the names of all the translators that you need to contact. You would have to figure out, again, because we're freelancers, who sort of fits within that structure. Would you contact everyone that that publisher has worked with? Would you contact everyone that they are likely to work with? Would you contact everyone who already has contracts underway currently? The Norwegian example is sort of an example of this, where clearly everyone who had contracts underway with publishers did participate in this action, or I assume at least everyone or the vast majority. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. This method is very clear that you need a supermajority on board to win. You can't just have 50% or even 60%. You need a supermajority in order to be able to get what you want. And that's sort of the organizing part. So that entails most likely, not everyone will be on board with your cause already. So that would entail talking to them and trying to get them to get on board with you, moving them from their current position to a position that is sympathetic to your cause. Then you would be crafting a stepwise campaign that would actually have the chance of the publisher saying yes to signing on. So perhaps that would include first, just a letter requesting them to sign on to the campaign. Then it might entail writing an open letter with all those translators and perhaps the authors as well, signing on and making that public, and so on. So it's a stepwise sort of escalation of pressure that, again, importantly, will ultimately have the chance of the publisher saying yes to win. Because that is what winning is. You have a clearly defined goal, which is that you want this specific thing from the specific actor, and you work methodically to get there. And I'll pass it over to Alex again.
Yes, great. Thanks for walking us through that, Kira. So again, the same thing applies when we're talking about changing our working conditions. We're talking about unions. This is the difference between unions and advocacy organizations. Advocacy organizations advocate. They often or may also mobilize, but they do not organize. They're not created to do that. Whereas unions are organizations. Although Jane McAlevey writes about this, some unions, she believes, or documents actually kind of abandoned organizing for mobilization and advocacy. But what unions can do that other types of organizations cannot is specifically organize. So again, building as a collective and as a workforce, not as individuals. So part of the work for us is to teach translators to see ourselves as workers. In the United States, freelancers do not have collective bargaining rights because of the laws that were rewritten in the 50s in response to accumulation of worker power and big wins. But the National Writers Union has found some ways, which we mentioned at the beginning, and Mayada talked about the unilateral announcements. So the National Writers Union has found some ways to win better pay and working conditions for freelance writers, even without collective bargaining rights. So that's what we are now exploring.
Part of the reason that translators have been so reluctant to organize in this fashion, or even talk about money during many official sort of gatherings under the umbrella of a specific organization that allows us to gather, is most likely due to something that happened in the 1990s. And this is again in the US, since that's the context that we're working in, but hopefully you'll still find it interesting even if you're elsewhere. An organization called the American Translators Association, or ATA, which is home to mostly technical translators and interpreters. They'd done a compensation survey, which they'd gone on to publish. that publication kicked off an investigation by the Federal Trade Commission, which is the US antitrust body. The FTC construed that survey as being a call for translators to charge a specific fee, as if they were involved in price collusion, as if they were construction companies colluding on the price of concrete and artificially driving it up. Around that same time, the International Association of Conference Interpreters was also subject to an FTC investigation, which ended, in that case, with the FTC ordering the group to stop publishing and endorsing fee schedules and non-price aspects. The ATA was not found to have done anything wrong, formally speaking, but they still had to be involved in that investigation. It was very expensive and stressful. Both of these ordeals, of course, can be contrasted with other countries. Alex talked about Norway. In my native Sweden, the Authors Union for many years actually did mandate a base fee, which was agreed upon through collective bargaining. That specific practice wasn't always uncomplicated or popular, but it's sort of a good illustration of how different organizing can be in different places. The FTC rulings in both of these cases did not actually say that translators and interpreters couldn't discuss rates amongst themselves. But it made these organizations really, really reluctant to allow any sort of discussion of rates within their organizational fora. And that culture has subsequently spread. It's also, of course, paired with a sort of widespread cultural sense that it's improper or rude to discuss money. And all of that taken together meant that there's been a real sort of damper on sharing the kinds of information that we actually need to hold in common amongst ourselves, also in order to lower thresholds for entry, especially for people who come from less connected backgrounds, so that they know what to charge, which will help us all when people don't undercharge by mistake, and also to improve our working conditions. Passing it on to Mayada again.
Yeah, and another really, and also I think it's this. I saw an article from 2023, kind of describing that the situation is quite similar in the UK, but maybe someone could shed a bit more light on that for us during Q&A. Another really important thing to mention is that our organizations, most of our organizations are professional service organizations, and that means that they can excel in advocacy. But they're generally not set up to organize or even do substantial political lobbying. So something like the US-based ALTA are barred from political activity because of their tax status. So yeah, these organizations are really helpful in all sorts of ways and necessary for a healthy translation ecosystem. But in order to actually build power, we need a different kind of forum. And one very important recent example of this from last autumn is the National Writers Union was the first union in the country to issue a statement about Palestine and Israel. The statement, which was issued on October 13th, described the Hamas attack as unconscionable, and it called for a ceasefire, and it said that Israel was carrying out massive ethnic cleansing in violation of international law. And it pointed out that it was doing so with the material and political support of the US. So pretty early on, in kind of no unclear terms. And this is obviously in really strong contrast with the response from most advocacy organizations, which either refused or declined to take a position and have continued to do so, sometimes in the face of really strong objection from their membership. The union also supports writers and journalists through a project of documenting retaliations against them in the US. So if they face retaliation for speaking out about the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, and support for it by the US government or US institutions, including universities and cultural organizations, these people can submit those reports that can document basically those retaliations through the union, the National Writers Union. Yeah, and I guess now to pivot slightly and give you a little bit of an overview of the kinds of projects that we're doing as a Translators Organizing Committee with the National Writers Union. And the aim of those is to build solidarity and identification with each other as translators, as people in the same workforce as workers, which, as we try to show, it's something that's missing from our field in general. We have two projects that are very new and still developing, as I said. One of them is the Solidarity Drop-ins, which we hope some of you will have seen on Twitter. Those are bi-monthly sessions that we hold on Zoom where translators can drop in and share questions or grievances to do with negotiating contracts with publishers. And we try to do this in a collaborative, mutual aid kind of environment rather than people kind of showing up with questions to ask an expert and the expert provides all the answers. And the reason why we want to do it like that, as we said, is to build solidarity and identification with each other as workers. And because it seems clear that that the more translators are able to ask for better terms, everybody benefits from them. So that's the Solidarity Drop-In project we have going. And so far we've held about 3 sessions, I believe. The next one, I believe, will be in August. The rate sharing tool is the other project we're working on. This is building on an existing project that the Freelance Solidarity Project has been working on. What it is basically is a really robust database of rates that media freelancers can use to negotiate higher compensation from publishers. We are building on that same database and creating a version just for translators. So what we want to do is to collect rates, anonymize them, and publish them in a public-facing database, just like FSB does. And that's another link that we'll share in the chat so people can see what that looks like. I'll pass it back to Kira.
And just briefly before we open up for Q&A, please remember to write your questions in the Q&A box if you have them. In terms of what's on the horizon, we're currently considering a campaign around AI. I saw that someone in the Q&A asked about that. That campaign would have as its goal for a publisher, one to start with, and ultimately, of course, many, to commit to not use AI translations and also not use our work to train AI algorithms and to not use generative AI translations, if you want to be more precise about it. We're really excited about this because it feels like a winnable campaign. And again, one of the lessons from Jane McAlevey is that it's really important to formulate campaigns that are actually winnable and then scale up from there. Losing is incredibly demoralizing and demobilizing. This is also a chance to build coalitions with non-translator writers and illustrators who are already in our union. And the sort of structure, this term that we keep talking would then be the specific publisher. And we will have to figure out how exactly to define that. I'll stop there and pass it on to Mayada.
So I think we're ending now, but we wanted to leave you with kind of one last request, which is that when you leave this talk and over the next few days, perhaps something we can do to kind of keep the conversation going is to try and think of 3 things that you most love or enjoy about being a translator, and the 3 things that feel to you get in the way of your loving and enjoying that work the most. Share them with a friend, talk about it, discuss it. Yeah, that's where we'll leave it today. And unless anyone wants to add anything, we'll open up for questions now. All right, we do have a couple in the Q&A section. The first here is from Rob Myatt, who asks, are there plans to use a new committee to promote greater solidarity with, for example, fellow workers outside the US and/or outside translation strictly? Or will the focus, at least initially, be largely on workers' rights for literary translators in the US?
I'd be happy to take a
Please.
stab at that? Yeah, I think, one of the reasons that we're excited about a campaign on AI is that it's an issue that concerns not only literary translators, right, but also authors, illustrators, photographers. So again, we're in the very early stages of conceiving this, but this is a campaign that would be with other freelance workers. So it wouldn't be limited to translation workers. I think also we're really, in a way, all in the same boat when it comes to that. And again, the two main demands on that would be, well, for translators, not to use AI to create translations, but again, that would be the same, for writing, for graphics, for images, not to use AI to create, and then not to use our labor, our work to train AI.
Yeah, so I think that responds at least in part to Nermin Abdelhafiz's question. Did you want to say something, Kira?
Yeah, in terms of Rob's question, I also wanted to add, unless you want to jump in and add something first, Mayada, that obviously the ultimate goal of organizing, I think, is like broad solidarity across worker categories. But again, with this emphasis on clearly defined structures, as well as the formulating campaigns that actually have a chance to win, it feels really important to be clearly defined and sort of focused, especially in the beginning as we build our power. But again, the benefit of being part of a sort of pre-existing union structure, and a union structure that also has other people and that has connections to organizations in other countries, as Mayada mentioned, for instance, journalists associations in Palestine. That means that we can act in solidarity in other ways that are perhaps not directly linked to the specific organizing projects that we're doing at the time.
Yes. Another question here from Kat, who is in the UK, who asks, legally speaking, how careful do you have to be when discussing rates with colleagues? I appreciate there might be a US-UK difference here. If anyone knows the actual laws or guidelines, I would really appreciate that information. And it looks like some information was shared in the chat.
I'm sorry, I was reading, and so I didn't hear. This was about the local trade union?
No, this is about how careful we have to be when discussing rates with colleagues.
Well, it depends who you ask. It depends on the laws in your country. Again, as Kira shared during the earlier part, there was a time when the political environment in this country was such that I guess, because of this investigation of the ATA, there was essentially a chill on literary translators talking with each other about their rates, but not when you're, out on the street or in an office. It was about sharing them publicly. But, for instance, I have had on my website at various times examples of how much I charge for things. I know Danny Hahn very famously has done that on his website. So, I think the fear of that, it just goes to show what a chilling effect one major event can have decades down the line. I don't think it's a big thing to be worried about at this point. But I just want to say it's a different thing if you're talking about translators speaking about it with each other versus an organization talking about rates, which is why the wording for the information on rates in the UK is so carefully constructed on the SOA website. Yes, as Kira just noted in the chat, the SOA rate is an observed rate, not a minimum or standard or anything else. Yeah.
That's an important distinction. Because we only have 9 minutes left, I'll move on to Michelle Hutchinson's question, which is, how does one set up a local trade union? We are considering this in the Netherlands at present.
Yeah, I actually also, answered that one in the chat. I said I have no idea. But I would go to a national trade union and ask them. And I suggested the Writers Guild of Great Britain. I know people said that the SOA is also a trade union, but my sense has been that the Writers Guild of Great Britain actually operates more like a trade union than the SOA does. And I think it was Rob Myatt also said the same thing in the chat. So that's something to look into.
Maybe I'll add there too that the way that we started this, we were not doing it within the sort of contact with the National Writers Union came later. We were just meeting. So I know that the person who asked the question talked about the Netherlands specifically. So perhaps the UK ones are not as directly relevant. But we met for about 2 years on and off and just discussed like what it might look like, what our principles were going to be, and then started exploring where we might find sort of an institutional home or if we wanted to do it separately. I think starting to meet in a sort of committed way is probably one of the first steps. Of course, you need to know the people that you're organizing with and sort of find a mutual sort of platform that you do want to organize within. So I would say meeting and talking is the first step, but then I think it does depend on the specific country that you're in, what organizations do exist there. It is helpful to work within a pre-existing structure because they will have legal support. You can learn so much from working with others, obviously, and it helps you build broader solidarity.
Leah Bruna asked, who is a translator from Italian and union delegate from the union called STRAID, which is part of CGIL, the main Italian union center. She asks, do you have discourse around the decision-making process? Do you have delegates and representatives? How do you keep track of workers you're able to get on, and how do you keep them involved? And are you sometimes able to meet in person? How often? And lastly, thank you for this. It was very refreshing.
Do you want to answer that, Mayada?
So we're still, like I said, it's a very kind of new effort, and there are things that we're still working out, including things like the decision-making process. We're at the stage that Kira was just describing, which is like meeting quite often, initiating these projects and building them up. We don't meet in person yet, but I think that's something also on the horizon. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else here. Most of our meetings happen on Zoom, and like I said, the sessions, at least for the solidarity drop-ins, are open for anyone to join.
Maybe I'll say also that the union, the bigger union, which again we're part of, does have bylaws. There was just a bylaw refresh. The union is sort of undergoing a revitalization at the moment. There is there is a whole structure. Again, we're very small at the moment, and so in terms of like our smaller group within that bigger group, we will ultimately, hopefully, form a chapter, a translators chapter or division within the union, and then we will be adhering to those bylaws more strictly. But we're focusing on setting up all of that now and moving very slowly in terms of bringing on board actual like new full-on members in order to have a really solid structure to work from, so that when we do bring on board people, we can actually activate them and like put people to work and like have structures where they can start doing stuff independently as well. The AI project will hopefully be one of those where we will be able to invite many more people to actually do work. The idea here is that it's a members union, it's a working union. It's not, again, like it's not a service organization. It's like all members are volunteers and work for themselves, so to speak.
Alex?
Yeah, I wanted to, this was a question, it was not in the Q&A, but it's kind of building off of what Kira just said. And it does, I think it's important because it sheds light on or uplifts the solidarity aspect of unions as different from advocacy organizations. And there was a question or observation about the cost of union dues for the National Writers Union. The union does not have a full staff. The work of the union is done at this point, the National Writers Union, by union members. So it's on us to support the union so that we can build solidarity for ourselves. That said, the leadership of the union made it clear to us from the get-go when we first started talking with them about forming an organizing committee for literary translators that they fully understand they're working with freelancers and they don't actually require people to pay dues to be active in the union. The union doesn't exist if union members are not active in it. Again, it's not us. There's no staff, quote unquote, running the organization for members. So if you want to be involved in a campaign or in administration of a campaign, we're still figuring out what people can do. The rate sharing tool, I think, will be a great way for people to support and be involved in the work of the union by sharing the rates that they're paid and talking to other people about the importance of doing so themselves. That this is how we build solidarity and collective power.
That's right. Maybe we can get to Ottilie Mulzet's question quickly here, who talks about all the extra work that we have to do as literary translators, scouting books, promoting autism and their books, writing copy, liaison, talking to publishers and so on, all of which is uncompensated. They also noted that there can be kind of different gendered expectation in terms of who does this kind of work. So how can more awareness be raised about this?
Yeah, I think there are two good answers already in the Q&A box. Ruth says that the easy response to a question like, can you just translate some of these press quotes, please, will be, yes, and my charge for that work will be this much. And Charlie says that, agrees that we do need to ask to be paid and educate publishers on this. That's something that we talk about in our drop-in sessions too, this idea that the more everyone asks for a certain thing, the more of a standard that will be, which is why it's so important, again, that we think of ourselves as workers who are working in the same industry who need to have solidarity with each other. So even if you feel, some translators are academics who get paid full-time working at a university, but you still need to ask for a decent rate because that raises all of our boats, lifts all of our boats. The more everyone asks for copyrights, the more standard that will become. The more everyone asks to be paid for these sort of extra little things that probably don't take so much time, the more that becomes standard. And so it's really, I think, if the more we talk to each other, the more we educate ourselves as workers, the more we will be able to demand these better working conditions and the more standard they will become.
Last question, how can we keep in contact? So specifically for the Translators Organizing Committee, we will sometimes make announcements through the larger union, the National Writers Union's social media. I think the handle for Twitter is Pay the Writer. But we also have our own email, which I will share in the chat shortly. But yeah, since we're now at 7:30 here, 1:30 over there, we just want to say thank you all so much for being here, for engaging so thoughtfully with these things. We've been thinking about them a lot, so it feels really good to be sharing this with all of you. And yeah, we hope it's been useful.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Major thanks. Solidarity and free Palestine.